Did you know that Godot has the ability to create custom classes? These are useful scripts that can hold variables and even functions, and can make your code more readable and extensible, leading to less bugs and more productivity. In this video, I'll be adding a feature to a small project and show how classes can make this process easier, more streamlined, and less error-prone. As always, use the timestamps in the description or chapters in the video to skip the parts that you care about. I'll be using the Sproutlands asset pack by Nooble, link is in the description. So here's how the game stands so far. We have a character that can walk around, and when we click, she attacks in front of her. We also have this cow that can take damage and eventually die. The damage is handled like so. The weapon checks if the body it hits has a damage function, and if it does, it calls it, passing in its attack damage value. And inside of the enemy, we have the damage function. We subtract the damage from the health, and if it hits 0, it deletes itself. Now, I want the ability to knock the cow back whenever we hit it, which we can go about in a few different ways. We'll start with the straightforward approach, and then go over some problems it may cause and a better way to do it later. First off, inside of the weapon, I'll add a new variable called Knockback force, and we'll pass that into the damage function. We also need to know where the attack comes from, so we'll also pass in the position of the attack. Then, inside of the enemy script, I'll modify the damage function to take in these new parameters, and just apply a velocity change in the opposite direction of the attack. If I go back into the game, all seems perfect. So where's the problem? Well, there's something I didn't mention. We actually also have these trees and crates around the world that we can also break. And since we modified the damage function, if I try to hit them, the game crashes. That's because we haven't changed the tree and crate functions to take in these new parameters. To fix this, we'll have to go into the functions and add the new parameters to both the tree and the crate. Unfortunately, even though we have to add these parameters, the tree and the crate don't actually care about them. But because we changed what we're passing in here in the weapon, these have to have these parameters, otherwise we get a crash. I will say, if you have a small project and you're unlikely to change the damage function, this can be perfectly fine, but let's imagine you had 20 different scripts, all who do different things with the damage function. This can lead to a lot of complexity and issues down the line, and it can just be annoying to change these functions. So what can we do better? Let's start by adding a new script. I'll just call mine attack.gd, and I'll start with class name attack. What this class name does is it allows any script in the project to reference this attack class. We'll get into that more later, but for now I'll just add 3 variables. These are attack damage, knockback force, and attack position. We can also assign these a default value if we want, but I'll just keep mine blank. That's actually all we need for this file, so I'll go back to the enemy script, and instead of passing in these 3 parameters, I'll instead pass in one attack object, which I will annotate with type attack. Annotating it as attack gives us 2 benefits. This allows us to use autocomplete, and if we try to pass anything that isn't an attack into this function, the game will throw an error, and so we're guaranteed that the only thing passed into this function will be an attack. Of course, right now the function has errors, so instead of referencing the old variable names, I'll instead call attack.attack damage, attack.attack position, and attack.knockback force. Going back to our weapon class, we have to change how we call the damage function. Rather than passing in the 3 parameters, we'll first start by making a new attack object and assign the attack damage, knockback force, and position like so, and then instead of passing in the 3 variables, we'll instead pass in just the attack object. I'll make a similar change to the tree and crate, and if we go into the game, we can see that everything is still working fine. There's no crash to be seen. And you can see inside of the crate there's no reference to knockback at all. That's because this object doesn't want anything to do with the knockback variables, and so we don't need to specify them here. However, you can see if we call attack dot, Godot will autocomplete and suggest the attack damage, position, or knockback force. This means that we can add an arbitrary number of values to this class, and we have to change nothing at all in any of the functions that reference it. But if we wanted to, these variables would show up in autocomplete. To really drive home how easy it is to add something new, I'm going to add something called stun time. This won't actually do anything in the project, but we'll pretend that the enemy uses it. So inside the enemy, I'll add a new current stun time variable and assign it based on the attack's stun time. And then inside the weapon, we'll account for this by adding a stun time. Once again in game, we can see that we can hit the cow, the tree, or the crate, and everything works fine. We didn't even have to touch the tree or the crate because they don't care about a stun time, since stun time isn't relevant to them. Classes can also contain custom functions like this one that can reference the values stored inside of a class instance. These will also show up in autocomplete, and if I call the function when the enemy gets hit, we can see that the function gets called. Hopefully this shows you how useful classes can be if used correctly.